Hi everyone, this is Robert and welcome to IDG Live. Today we are talking about Lothlorien, this beautiful place behind me. So we're doing a Lord of the Rings live stream. As always, I will be taking questions from my patrons and also as much as I can from the chat. If you were here last week, apologies. Technology got the better of me. It sometimes does, I must admit. I tried to upload a pre-record. It did not work, so I thought we'll just go again. If you are a patron and you ask questions first time around, do not worry. I've got your questions here. I will answer them this time around, but I will also pick up whatever else I can in the chat as we are going through. So, with no real further ado, we will just sort of rattle through. But let's start looking at the history of Lothlorien. I'll give you a high-level overview here. So we all understand what it looks like, how it feels with Galadriel and Celeborn there, but obviously that's not how it started. Galadriel had many, many years wandering around before she ended up in Lothlorien. The first inhabitants of Lothlorien, which was a forest, were some elves that we now call the Nandor elves. Tolkien has many, many different types of elves, and I'm not going to go into all of the different categorizations here. But basically, this group of elves were some of those original elves who, when they first awakened, the Valar came over and said, "Hey, you should come over to Valinor. That's great over there." And they kind of like pushed them to come along, and the elves kind of broke down into a few different groups. Some of them didn't want to move at all. Some of them were dead keen on getting there. The the rest were in this kind of like middle group who sort of went, "Okay, well, we'll come along," um, but they kind of like stopped on the way. Now, a big group of them got all the way west as far as the Misty Mountains, massive mountain range, and went, yeah, this is kind of nice here. I don't really want to go over those mountains. And so they just stopped. And where they stopped is what we now call Lothlorien. At the time, they called this Lorinand. Obviously, Tolkien, as a linguist, he cared about the names of these things. Lorinand simply means land of the singers. And the elves in those early days, this is one of the things that they were famed for, being singers. So this seems to have been a group of elves who they were interested enough to go part of the way, but not interested enough to keep going. They lingered within Middle-earth. And they and the other elves nearby in what later became known as Mirkwood, before that was known as Greenwood the Great, they kind of adopted this more simple lifestyle. Let's put it that way. Some of the elves, the Noldor, as a classic example, they loved to craft things. They loved to develop what we might call magical technology. These elves here, the ones who ended up in Lothlorien, they much preferred the simple things, the arts and crafts, stuff like that. Are they living in the forest? This is where the whole Sylvan elves often emerge. Again, there's many routes through this to different names for these kinds of things. But if you're thinking of the classic wood elf, that's the kind of idea that we've got going on here. So they stayed there and lived quite happily for quite some time. Back then, it appears that these forests, this was quite a large forest. Lothlorien was attached to what we now know as Fangorn, and there was an agreement that the Ents of Fangorn could come and go into Lothlorien or Lorinand, and vice versa. The elves could come in. Eventually, those two forests got separated. Similarly, there was something with Greenwood the Great. They were close by, lots of exchange. That also got cut off. So we end up with this this forest area, which is kind of barred in on one side by the Misty Mountains, and on the other side we've got the Anduin River. So you can just in your Lord of the Rings memory already kind of picture this. When the Fellowship emerge from the Mines of Moria, it's within a day's travel to get there. That's how close this is to the exit from the Mines of Moria, from the East Gate of Moria, and the Misty Mountains. And then when the Fellowship leave on the other side, they get into boats and go down the River Anduin. So that's where we're talking, this kind of compressed area there in this kind of Anduin Valley. So they carried on for quite some time until we come to the end of the First Age. The end of the First Age, we get what can only be kind of called apocalyptic changes to the geography of Middle-earth. We get the War of Wrath. Now, if you read the Silmarillion, you'll know in the First Age, most of the stories that we have there in the First Age are based in Beleriand. Now, Beleriand, as a landmass, is kind of west of the map that we know of Middle-earth. So if you imagine right at the very western edge there, you get the Grey Havens and there's the Blue Mountains. If you've ever thought, oh, wow, I wonder why there's a mountain range right on the very edge of the map. That didn't used to be the very edge. There was this whole extra bit off to the west, Beleriand. That's the end of the War of Wrath, when the host of the Valar come in, they defeat Morgoth's forces, the cataclysmic changes happen, and all of Beleriand is basically destroyed. Now, the elves then kind of like shuffle off eastwards over into what we now think of as Middle-earth, that bit of map that we know. Most of them kind of gathered there in Lindon, which is at the western end. The Grey Havens are around that part of the world. And that was under the leadership of Gil-galad. Now, some moved on further. And one of these people was this guy called Amdir and his son Amroth. And they headed off into Middle-earth, and they ended up in Loninand. And they discovered a people who were very happy, but there was a bit of a leadership vacuum. There's no hint here that this was a hostile takeover or anything like that. We get Amdir, Amroth coming in, and they sort of took over and led them for a while into the Second Age. And as far as we can tell, they did a pretty solid job. It remained independent, it remained free. Sauron, partway through the age, invaded huge swathes of Middle-earth. That does seem to have survived. So they seem to have done an okay job. But also this kind of slightly tweaked the culture of the place, because these aren't now just these elves who've arrived, the Nandor elves who've arrived and settled down in this kind of as this woodland folk. We also get a few people who they've experienced life off in the West, and they've come in now. And at the end of the Second Age, perhaps against their better judgment, but along with their allies in Greenwood the Great, head down as part of the last alliance of elves and men. They are not particularly well armed, let's put it that way. Now, we often see this or read about this from the perspective of the Mirkwood, what will be the Mirkwood elves, because we get Odofer heading down there. That is Thranduil's father, and they head down with this force of lightly armored elves to this final battle against Sauron's forces just outside Mordor. And they're supposed to be taking instructions from Gil-galad, but they just decide to charge in anyway. Maybe there's a degree of arrogance there. Who knows? But they go in and they get decimated, absolutely wiped out. And this group of elves is, if you remember the Dead Marshes, that area just outside Mordor, where you get all of these bodies just lying underneath the water, that's them. The battle is horrendous and fierce, and a lot of them die, and eventually a few of them manage to limp back home afterwards. We often think about this from the perspective of the elves of Mirkwood, because that had a clear impact on Thranduil. Thranduil was traumatized by this, really, really traumatized by this, and he did not even want to look south anymore. That's how much it kind of impacted on him. The change in his own forest, the change to be a dark place, ruled the southern part of it ruled from Dol Guldur, Sauron himself setting up base there. That all happened, at least in part, because Thranduil just refused to look south. If you think back to the Hobbit characterization of the Elven King as this guy who's just there having feasts and having fun and drinking wine, that's the impression that Tolkien wanted you to have of this guy. He was just displacing. He didn't want to be thinking about these serious matters. We often think about it from their perspective, but just as big an impact would have happened to the elves of Lothlorien. And in particular, we get Amdir, their king, who died. Amroth, his son, took over. And he ruled through the Third Age. Now, or through a degree of the Third Age. We'll come back to him in just one moment. Now, I said we'll come back to him because at this point we need to start talking about Galadriel and Celeborn. Galadriel and Celeborn were not part of the initial group who were there in Lothlorien. They were also not part of Amdir and Amroth's group who headed over there. However, they did, during the Second Age, the two of them started to look around Middle-earth, let's put it that way. We're told that Galadriel, and this is part of her big journey as a person, is a journey of pride and a desire for power, a desire to rule some lands on her own without correction or instruction from anyone else. She was looking for somewhere to rule. And she, it appears, was always reasonably friendly with the dwarves in Khazad-dûm, unlike her husband, who seems to have been quite the opposite. But she seems to have got on really well with them. And the elves of Lothlorien also seem to be getting on very well with the elves of Khazad-dûm, to the extent that when we get Sauron in disguise as Anatar in Eregion, Galadriel suspects something's going on. She may or may not have known exactly what was going on, but anyway, she leaves. Tolkien wrote various different versions of this, but she leaves. And she heads out through Khazad-dûm and ends up in Lothlorien, and she spends a reasonable amount of her time there among those people. And then, when everything goes wrong and Sauron invades, he forged his One Ring, his cunning plan with all of these other rings of power didn't quite work out, so he goes, oh, forget it, I'll just invade everywhere. And he charges off into Eregion, and Eregion falls. Some of the elves have to escape, and some of those elves head east through Khazad-dûm, and they end up in Lothlorien. So we get this third influx even, of elves into what will at some point later become known as Lothlorien. So we're already getting within elven culture quite a multicultural situation going on there. Galadriel, it's not her home, but she does spend a huge amount of time there. It seems probably Celeborn does as well. Moving forward into the Third Age, we've still got Amroth there, who is being king, and he was in love with an elf maid known as Nimrodel. Now, during the Third Age, we get, this is roughly 1,000 years before the events of the Lord of the Rings, Khazad-dûm falls into darkness. That's the way that the elves remember it. We remember this as being, this is when Durin's Bane appears. The dwarves delved too deeply. They awoke the Balrog. The Balrog chased them out, and at that point, whatever strong and positive relationship had been had between the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Lothlorien collapsed. We often think of, and we're right to think, that the really good, positive elven-dwarf relationship was between the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Eregion, and that is entirely right. But it does seem that there was a relatively positive sort of a agreement relationship with the elves on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains as well. But when Khazad-dûm fell, that may have been part of the trigger. There may well have been other reasons. Then Amanoth and Nimrodel went away. It's like they kind of we're not really told all of the reasons, but they headed off and they kind of disappeared. Last seen down in the White Mountains. Perhaps they ended up, who knows, heading off into a boat into the west. But that meant that, again, the elves there in Lothlorien did not have a leader. Enter Galadriel and Celeborn, who took over. Now, again, this does not seem to be a hostile takeover. This seems to be just a recognition. We need someone governing here. Who hands up who wants to do it. And Galadriel was very keen to do this, Celeborn too. And so they came in and they ruled. Now, they, I think, quite noticeably, did not take the titles of king and queen. They were the lord and lady of Lothlorien, which is a small but I think important staging post in Galadriel's journey. Remember, she was there wanting to rule land on her own. But her first act here seems to have been to say, okay, I'm not going to take the grandiose title. I'm not going to be a queen. Outside, people seem to still call her the queen of Lothlorien, but inside, she only took the title of lady. And the two of them ruled. And during this time, Lothlorien became known as Lothlorien. And the reason for that was that when Galadriel came in, she did a lot of things. First of all, she kind of moved the center of base further westwards, definitely over the other side of the Anduin. And Caras Galadhon was this kind of heart of the forest that was created, and she created a defensive, magical kind of a structure around this, using the power of her One Ring. She used that to preserve time within Lothlorien. Now, Tolkien shifted around a little bit about what the exact details of this are. I've got a question on that later, so I'll come back to it. But the whole point was that this was now a preserved area, protected against the ravages of time outside. She had the secret of making lembas bread. So she brought that in with her. And also she had these, the nuts of malorn trees. Now, malorn trees come from the far west, and they tried to grow them in Lindon, where Gil-galad was, but that didn't work. But Gil-galad gifted Galadriel with some of these seeds, and she planted them within Lothlorien, and the trees grew. Probably because of the preserving powers of the ring that she got. Why does this impact on the names? Well, the reason is that malorns have, in autumn, they have these golden leaves. And um, Lothlorien literally means golden wood of the blossom. And so that was what it was known. And in fact, Windfola, this is your question over on Patreon. I'll sort of cover it here. You say, why does the name of Lothlorien change over time? What are the meanings of the different names? So here we have golden wood of the blossom, which is just recognizing it's a description of what it is. And it is that's because of the Malon trees. And many, many years later, one of those melon trees is grown in the Shire because Galadriel's gift to Sam was a little box which had a whole lot of dirt effectively and one nut in it. And the nut was the nut of a melon tree. That Sam planted where the party tree had been in the Shire, and which had been chopped down before the scouring of the Shire. He replanted the party tree and grew a melon there in the Shire, which is symbolic of many things. It's him remembering the beauty of the elves. It's this moment of the elves who were all obviously about to head off west, the last memory of them. But also I think it's something quite touching about the Shire, which is that we know the melons, they don't just grow anywhere. They didn't grow in Linden, which is not that far from the Shire, with people who were pretty good with trees. They only seemed to grow in this exact area of Lothlorien where the ravages of time were kept out. The fact that one grew in the Shire shows, yes, Sam's really good at gardening, but also the Shire also had that kind of magic to it in some way that everything else, the outside world, was kept at bay. So anyway, that's why we have Lothlorien called Lothlorien. Now, what this means is that we had this culture of elves who started out as being quite woodland folk, just wanting to be not caring about what's going on in the outside world, not wanting to be interested in anything really industrial, particularly crafting or anything like that. Other elves have joined, slightly nuancing that over the millennia, but still to the end of its days, Galadriel then kept it as this place that held at bay the ravages of time. And that means that all through its life, Lothlorien, whatever it was called at the time, had this feel of a place which was kept away from whatever else was going on outside of time. And so you will find when you read the chapters there in The Lord of the Rings, it's not just a place which is, oh, well, this is nice and this is pretty. It has some recuperative powers as a place, and particularly the water, the running water. There's a stream that runs from the heart, Carascaladon, all the way out through Lothlorien. That has healing powers and it has recuperative powers, and that is the kind of feel we've got all the way through this. That it was just what Galadriel did was not to reshape this place in her own image, but to take what was already there and just amplify it. Okay, that is the broad history, I would say, of Lothlorien. I think the only thing I would add to that is obviously what happens at the very end, which is after the One Ring is destroyed and the power of the other rings of power has gone. Slowly, it returned back to nature. The elves who were there sort of holding on. Tolkien, he doesn't often talk about it in this kind of light, but it's kind of tragic in a way. It's like if you imagine like there's a circle and the elves are staying inside the circle and saying, no, 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 no. I know that we're not made for this world, this part of the world with the ravages of time up and down and um, birth and death and rebirth, constant changes all the time. We're not made for that. We're made for eternity, but we're holding it back. When what is holding it back is gone, the power of the ring, it's very soon, within 100 years, it has gone. The elves have passed away, and you get Arwen actually visits there towards the end of her life and sees it return to nature. It's it's quite a beautiful thing, actually, in a way. From Tolkien, he writes so many beautiful things, but this was a great civilization that lasted from the very, very earliest days. This is one of the oldest civilizations in the entirety of Middle Earth. It went through a few changes and shifts over time, but the very first children of Iluvatar to be born, who headed west. Some of the one of the first places that those who headed west stopped and went, "Yeah, I'm not going any further." That was here. This is a place where elves had lived for such a long time, and then when they left, it was not like this kind of Ozymandias place where you can see all of these great built structures and look upon them with despair in your eyes. It's nature has returned to take over it. Okay, that's enough of me rhapsodizing about this. Let's go to some questions from my patrons. Let's go to Elsbeta M. Celeborn is regarded as being one of the wisest elves in Middle-earth. But what in particular, aside from marrying well, illustrates this remarkable wisdom? Yeah, this is a question which we get a lot. Because he doesn't come across as wise, it has to be said. Galadriel introduces himself as Celeborn the Wise. And yet, there he is when we meet him, and he seems to be one step behind her. She's kind of knows what's going on with Gandalf. He's like, "Oh, where's Gandalf?" And it's very clear that it's his orders that meant that Gimli was treated so poorly when he first arrived in Lothlorien, and he's there. His orders that say that Gimli had to be blindfolded. Everyone else was all right, but Gimli had to be blindfolded, and that nearly caused an issue because then the Fellowship were like, well, if he's going to be blindfolded, we all have to be blindfolded. That was Aragorn's cunning way of getting through this anyway. So he does not come across very well to start with. But Galadriel, who does come across as quite wise, calls him the wise. So where is it? Well, the first point is the point you make. Yeah, he chose his wife well. That is a wise decision to marry Galadriel. Beyond that, though, what can we kind of see? Well, he does here in the story that we have. He does offer wise counsel, and he does offer wise gifts. We think a lot about the gifts that Galadriel gives because they're cool, because they're kind of appropriate. She gives the Phial of Galadriel. I've already mentioned, the little box that she gives to Sam. Great foresight there. This is going to help restore the Shire at the end of it all. She gives a very personal gift to Aragorn. We just think, yeah, she knows what she's doing. Celeborn gives gifts and advice, and it's just really down to earth and very practical, because the Fellowship, as they arrive, they don't really know what to do now. It's easy to forget, but even as they left Rivendell, they didn't have a clear plan of what they were going to do. The Fellowship as a whole wasn't even proper Fellowship. The only person who had any kind of charge laid on him was Frodo. And everyone else was just like, all I ask from you is to go with Frodo as long as you will. And while you're there, protect him. But there were disagreements. about where to go. There was disagreements between Gandalf and Aragorn about how to cross the Misty Mountains. Then there were differences between Boromir and Aragorn and the rest about whether to go to Minas Tirith. So there were lots of these disagreements. The Fellowship were never completely laser focused on this is the plan, we're doing this exactly. They were kind of making it up as they went along. And Celeborn seems to have understood this, because he was the person who gave the advice to say, okay, well, you've got an issue here. Some of you want to be going east over to Mordor. Some of you want to be going or staying on the west of the Anduin and going to Minas Tirith. It's probably good for you to stay together as long as possible. And added to which, our scouts say that there's a lot of orcs around at the moment. So I'm going to give you these boats. You can go down the Anduin. I'll tell you exactly how far you can get until you have to make a decision. And that was the advice, and it was good advice. It meant that they managed to avoid the orc bands for a pretty long time. It meant that the Fellowship stayed together for a pretty long, or as long a time as they possibly could. And it allowed them time to think about stuff. So very practical advice that's not glitzy or glamorous. It's not the kind of thing where we look back on and make magnificent videos about how amazing the Fire of Galadriel is. That's the kind of thing I do, or whatever. But it's solid and it's sound. And this is where I think this Celeborn the Wise comes from. It's just very practical. A little bit earlier, I talked about way back in the Second Age, when Galadriel left Eregion and went to stay over in what was to be Lothlorien for a while. Celeborn didn't do that. They actually, as a couple, I don't think it was separated, is probably the wrong word for this, but they were in different places for a long period of time. And Galadriel was heading off over to Lothlorien with their daughter. Okay, maybe they thought that was a good and safe place for her to be. Maybe she was thinking, longer term, where can we go? Celeborn stayed back in Eregion, and we're told that he was one of the key people in the fight against Sauron, who invaded in the not too distant future after that. So again, it's not glitzy, it's not glamorous, but he seemed to be aware that this was going to be happening and that perhaps he was needed. So wise, yeah, but not really in an obvious way. I think it's very down to earth, what his wisdom was like. Let's go to Anne E saying, hi, Robert and Dan. Hello. When Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas meet the riders of Rohan for the first time, Éomer implies that the Lady of Lothlorien captures and maybe kills anyone who strays into the forest. Is that true? Do they kill or imprison trespassers instead of forcing them to leave? So what is very apparent is that whatever reputation Galadriel and Celeborn may have inside Lothlorien, outside, everyone knows that it's her who's like the main power. But they all seem to have this opinion of what she's like. Gimli has these kind of like stereotypical views of what the Queen of Lothlorien's like Éomer does. It seems as if around the outside, people who've never been in have got this idea. And the idea is that of, this strong witch woman who kills and things like that. So it's the kind of thing that makes me wonder, is that deliberate? on Galadriel's part is she's clearly happy. At the very least, she's happy for those ideas to be out there, and probably it helps with the defenses of Lothlorien. So again, this seems like a sensible kind of thing. If you let it be known that anyone who steps inside Lothlorien will be killed, then people are a lot less likely to be stepping into Lothlorien. So I think this is just a little bit of propaganda management, message management, whatever you want to call it, on her part. Now, it's not just messaging, is the thing we have to say. It's very clear from when the Fellowship do head into Lothlorien that there are elves there who are prepared to kill people who enter who shouldn't be there, orcs in particular. They, however, don't shoot on sight because the Fellowship come in. They know Aragorn. Aragorn has been there before. They know Legolas by reputation. The hobbits, they obviously have no idea who they are. Gimli, not really. Boromir, etc. It's just like it's really only one person who they knew within that group who came in there, but they didn't kill them on sight. So it's a bit of an exaggerated truth. If you went into Lothlorien with evil intent, then yes, the elves would either shoot you or they would guide you off to a part of the forest where you probably wouldn't return from. Let's go to a question from Matt C, saying, "Hi, Robert. First time, long time. Great to have your question. What is the story significance of the time dilation effect that occurs in Lothlorien? As a practical matter, it seems like getting sucked into a time warp is a problem if you're trying to save the world." Yeah, so Tolkien, I kind of hinted this earlier. Happy to unwrap this a little bit more. Tolkien changed his mind on this a couple of times. It's clear that in at least one of the earlier drafts, when the Fellowship go into Lothlorien, it actually stops time for them, and they kind of head out on the same day, pretty much, even though they spent some time in Lothlorien. He then changed his mind and said, no, actually, they do spend physical time there. It's not like a proper time warp. So what is going on is it's not that, and I've used this word a few times, but I think it is the right one. It is the ravages of time that are prevented from entering Lothlorien. It is not time itself that stops. So time still carries on, but the ill effects of time are held back. Now, what that means is that it helps with the healing, it helps with resting and recovery. So all of the just troubles and strains of like extra time walking, whatever, that those things are left aside. And actually what you've got is this kind of restorative atmosphere there within the forest, because it is letting things live as if time weren't an issue. Time passes, but it's as if time doesn't have the impact on things in the same way. So that's what's going on there. And this is the power of the One Ring. And being, therefore, in Lothlorien helped the Fellowship, not just in their physical recoveries, but also the kind of mental and spiritual recoveries from what happened. I think they did it really well in the films, and certainly when they leave Moria, and everyone's just distraught. And they arrive in Lothlorien. That's the kind of the feel, is that they've lost their leader. They've lost the person, particularly for the hobbits. It's like, this is the person we trust. This is the person who's been leading us, who's been guiding us, whose wisdom we've been following all of this time. And they don't know what to do. And that is healed. It's also worth, I think, pointing out that after the Fellowship have gone, Gandalf arrives and Gandalf heals. Now, he's obviously died and come back, but then he gets picked up by Gwaihir and brought to Lothlorien, where Galadriel heals Gandalf. So it's almost as if everybody knows there's, the wise, the powers that be, understand that this is the healing, recuperative place. They could have taken, the Eagles can go wherever they want. They could have taken him to Elrond, who's clearly a great healer, but actually what was needed was this more recuperative period for Gandalf. Yeah, I think that probably answers that one. Let's go to Carl Karsnock saying, I'm 99.9999% sure Robert has a secret Frankenfurter act we haven't seen yet. And you're not going to see. Let's go to Jerry Invincible saying, hi Robert, what distinguishes Lothlorien from the other major elven settlements of Middle-earth, like the Woodland Realm and Rivendell? I'm thinking particularly about its geography being like Mirkwood, but also that it is the home of a ring-bearer. How is the place linked to Nenya? P.S. I'm currently in London to see the Lord of the Rings trilogy performed live at the Royal Albert Hall by the London Philharmonic Orchestra. Highly recommend it for anyone who loves the films. I have to say, I've never seen. I've heard so many good things, but I've never seen the Lord of the Rings films with the full orchestra. I've heard amazing things about it. One day, it's on my list. I shall do that. But I'm glad you enjoyed it. And the Royal Albert Hall, fantastic venue. In terms of what sets this, or how we compare this, or what sets this apart from the others, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, in that it is culturally quite like the elves of Mirkwood. But we have a big difference. We have a big difference in leadership, and we have a big difference in the fact that we've got the Ring of Power there. And yes, so whereas what happened in Greenwood the Great, which became Mirkwood, is we have elves who come from the same kind of cultural background. It's quite similar. These are elves who they headed right at the very beginning of the story. They headed west and then looked at the Misty Mountains and went, no, I'm not crossing that. And they stayed where they were. And then they embraced this kind of like more rustic lifestyle, this kind of sylvan elf, woodland elf kind of lifestyle, as we might think of it. That's very similar between Lothlorien and Mirkwood. But then when we get the leadership, Thranduil, as we've noticed, or noted, he doesn't want to confront evil, and so he just ignores it. Compared to Galadriel and Celeborn, who don't want to confront evil, but they protect the area that they're in. You get Galadriel, classic example. She says, I can read Sauron's mind, at least those parts of it, concerning the elves, and he forever reaches out but cannot see me. He cannot kind of permeate this barrier I've put up. It's this kind of protective barrier, which is the first big difference here. We've got this, I'm not even going to think about evil, and the kind of implication of what happened in Mirkwood was that Dol Guldur, Sauron came into Dol Guldur, and then evil started pushing north and north and north and north, and the elves just no, not paying any attention, and they just carried on partying. That's what happened in Mirkwood. Lothlorien, yeah, there was evil around them, but they just built a big magical wall effectively around themselves and kept in contact with the wider world. It's very noticeable when you look at the council, the White Council, or the Wise. Galadriel is there at the heart of it. We get Galadriel and Celeborn playing a full role in the defense. The Free People's work against Sauron. That's not the case for Thranduil. That's not the case for the Elves of Mirkwood. They have different views of this kind of isolationist approach, but it's still there. And then what we have in Mirkwood is we have Thranduil established himself in this kind of series of caves. It's not a woodland. They love the woodland, but it's not a woodland home. In fact, this is apparently, it would seem, a kind of deliberate copying of the idea of Menegoroth, which was the land of Doriath way back in the First Age, which had beautiful caves. And they lived there. But it seems that Thranduil's version was not as big, not as impressive. Galadriel seems to have managed to capture the feel of this with the implications of what was known as the Girdle of Melian around it, and the beauty of the place, which we're told that Menegoroth was one of the greatest, most wonderful built structures Middle-earth ever knew. We don't read that about the caves of northern Mirkwood. So Galadriel understood the spirit and the point of what was going on, not just the let's live in some caves kind of thing. So that's what it is. And just as an aside, Galadriel lived for some years in Doriath. She became friends with Bielemeier, who was there. And many people, Tolkien never explicitly says this, but many people do kind of draw this very clear line from her learning from and studying Melian. And Melian had this, it was known as the Girdle of Doriath, which was this kind of magical circle, a defensive line around the forest. And something similar seems to be the case around Lothlorien. So probably Galadriel learned something of how that operated from Melian and did it herself when she had her own place to rule. Another example, a sort of a comparison, obviously would be Rivendell, because the two of them have the power of the ring. Rivendell is smaller, and it's also more deliberately open. It welcomes people. It is the last homely house, last friendly house, and that's the whole point, is that this is there to be acting as this hub for other peoples. Elrond was he fostered the children, the heirs to the Northern Kingdom. He welcomed Gandalf there. He had welcomed Galadriel, but he welcomed Gandalf there. The dwarves came through, and he showed them hospitality. Bilbo was allowed to live and stay there. This was a place as a home, a hub for the free peoples of Middle-earth, which is not what Lothlorien was. Lothlorien was an elvish place. So yeah, there's lots of sort of contrasts we can have, but there's bits of lots of different things, but Galadriel made it her own. Let's go to Katrina V. Thank you for taking our questions. You're welcome. At the end of the Lothlorien chapter, at the foot of Ceden Amroth, where he and Arwen, Aragorn and Arwen, had pledged themselves to each other, Aragorn says, Arwen Vanimelda Namarie. What does that mean? And what is the significance of it? Galadriel, just to be clear, she is Arwen's grandmother. And Arwen was there, although we think of her as being based in Rivendell, she was there in Lothlorien visiting her grandmother when Aragorn, who had been on his travels around the world, young Aragorn, he returns and goes to Lothlorien. He meets Arwen there, and that's where they fall in love. So uh, that's kind of like where he remembers her. And we get the gifts that Galadriel give to Aragorn are very clearly in line with this idea that this is her giving her blessing to their match. Which is kind of like this lead into, yes. So what he says is Arwen van Imelda Namarie. Now, Arwen obviously is her name. Namarie is if you want an Elvish word, it's a fantastic one. It basically means farewell. And not just like in English, we might say goodbye. It is farewell on your travels. Be well, blessings on you. That's the kind of feel of this. And then when we get Van Imelda, that is a compound word of really Vanni and Melda, which are fair or beautiful and also beloved. So it's like this a word which means much loved, beautiful one. So if you kind of put it all together, it is something along the lines of farewell, Arwen, my beloved, beautiful one, which is a lovely thing to say. The significance, he's heading off now to do the thing. He will know that is his last friendly place. Aragorn is not the same in the books as he is in the films. In the films, he's uncertain about his faith, his fate, about his role as king. He kind of like he pushes Arwen away, tells her to go off west. Uh, doubts the blood of Isildur runs through my veins too. All of this kind of stuff. That's not in the books. In the books, from the start, he's very clear. He is the heir of Isildur. He is the heir of Elendil, and his fate is to become the king of the reunited kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. He embraces that. And he also is madly in love with Arwen and would not ever want to send her away. So uh, he is very focused on what he's doing, but at the same time, he's not stupid. He knows that he's about to head off into the most dangerous few months of his entire life. So when he's saying farewell, it's not just to Arwen. It is to she's kind of figuratively giving her blessing and saying, "Go now," and he's there going, "Well, I'm going, and I hope I come back." He had faith, he had belief, but he is saying farewell. Okay, so let's have a quick flick through the chat. Reflective Ramblings saying, I always assumed that Rivendell didn't necessarily welcome everyone with open arms, but some were allowed in by guards. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably fair. It's a when I'm talking about the distinction between Lothlorien and Rivendell, you just have to know what the reputation of the two places is to understand their role. The reputation of Lothlorien is don't go there. There's an evil witch there. They kill people on sight if you try and enter there. And then Rivendell, this is the last homely house. This is this is friendly. That's the difference in feel that we have between these two kind of places. Elrond, he wasn't a pushover. If somebody came to the borders of Rivendell that he didn't want to be there, as we saw with the Nazgul, he would just get rid of them. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. But he saw one of his key roles there in the Third Age to be this hub for knowledge, for wisdom, and for peace and for safety for people who needed it. And so, yeah, it wasn't just a anyone can wander in kind of thing. It was not like the Prancing Pony. It it was a home for the free peoples. Quick flick through, and last homely house, Mark Sheesa saying, did other people ever travel to Rivendell and could stay there? Yes, I think that's where Reflective Rambling was replying to that one. Some people did, but it's not as if you have to remember that part of the world. There weren't that many people there. That whole area west of the Misty Mountains, heading up to the northwest. That if you go northwest of there, you're coming into the what used to be the Kingdom of Arnor, but now it's not. There's not that much in terms of human settlements there. There's Bree lands, which is Bree, but there's also a few other little villages around the outside. And then you get the Shire a bit further away, but there's no other big towns or cities. Rodalida saying sending love to the moderators for keeping the chat safe and sound. Yes, great opportunity for me to send some love to the moderators. Moderators, thank you. You do a fantastic job. You always do. If you are there watching live in the chat, do please send them a little bit of love. I would hugely appreciate it. I would also love to send a bit of love to my patrons. I can't do what I do without your support, so thank you so much. I hugely appreciate it. If you do want to support the channel, the best way to do that is through Patreon. There should be a link probably down there somewhere. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And a few hellos. If you're watching this on Facebook, great to see you. We've got a growing number. I keep on meaning to figure out how we do the whole moderation and things over there as well. There's a growing number of people following In Deep Geek over on Facebook, so it's great to see you as well. I know you're there also on X as well. We're streaming over on X, so fantastic to see you too. Let's go to some questions from my patrons again. Not all those who wander are lost. What do we know about Galadriel and Celeborn's history? When did they meet? When was their daughter born? When did they begin occupying Lothlorien? Now, I don't have the quote in front of me, but I use it a lot because it's always important to say this before talking about the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. And this is a quote from Christopher Tolkien, who knew more than any of us ever will about his father's works. And he said, nowhere else in the history of Middle-earth is more, and I can't remember the exact words to say, is more confusing and complicated than the history of Galadriel and Celeborn in the Second and Third Ages. What they were doing and where his father changed his mind several times. The importance of Galadriel grew as Tolkien was creating his universe. She started out as an important figure, but the centrality of her came much, much later on in this process. And what that means is that it kind of shifted going through time where she was and why she was in different places at different times. And Celeborn, similarly, we have a couple of different versions of his origin as well. Now, what and therefore exactly who he is. Now, we obviously know a lot of his life in Middle-earth, but was he a prince of Doriath, or was he perhaps one of the Teleri? We don't know. Could he be in both? Possibly. What we do know is that he and Galadriel met in Doriath. Now, I kind of name checked this a little bit earlier, but the big history here is that Galadriel is one of the Noldor elves. Now, way back before the First Age, you get this rebellion is probably the best way of saying it. Feanor led the Noldor elves out of Valinor and over to Middle-earth, determined to reclaim the Silmarils that Morgoth had got. There's a whole lot more to that story, but he was the head of the Noldorin elves, and he basically said, "Come on, guys, come with me." Some stayed where they were. Most headed off to Middle-earth. Galadriel was one of those Noldor who came with him. We're told, again, story shifts around exactly what's going on, but we're told by Tolkien that she wasn't going there just because she believed in Feanor. In fact, we're told that they were unfriends forever. She did not like him. But she went because she desired to rule lands in Middle-earth. Now, when the Noldor arrive, they discover there's a whole situation going on there with a whole load of elves who've already spread out over Middle-earth, over Beleriand, and they've all got their own kingdoms and things like that. And then Morgoth escapes from what's a centuries-long siege of his home base and starts rolling out over Beleriand and killing everyone. Now, into this, Galadriel doesn't do huge amounts that we read about on the page in the Silmarillion in the First Age. She spends most of her time, as far as we can tell, in Doriath with Melian the Maya. Where we don't know, reading between the lines, that at least part of the implication is that A, she's learning from Melian, as we've already mentioned, and then B, probably she'd experienced a lot bad things. When Feanor left, there was what is known as the kinslaying, and in this, he needed to get some ships, and in order to get those ships, he demanded them from the Teleri elves, some other elves. They said no, and then he started killing other elves. This is an abomination. He got the ships, and he headed off. Galadriel seems to have been caught up in that, and that fight will have been between the peoples of the different sides of her family. Horrendous stuff. She will have seen family members fighting each other and dying. And then she will have gone off with a whole load of the Noldor across what is known as Feanor went off on those boats, but a lot of the Noldor went over the Helcaraxa, which is basically the North Pole. Many more died that way. And then she finally arrives in Middle-earth. And so I think the implication is that probably she was a little bit traumatized by it. She needed to take a breather. She needed a break. She didn't immediately go out and try and do the things that she set out to do. So that seems to be the second reason. The third reason seems to be that she met Celeborn. Now, if Celeborn is, as we seem to think, this kind of like calm, low-key wise guy who does the practical stuff, maybe that's what she needed at that moment in time. Maybe that's part of what drew them together. I tend to the view that this is one of those relationships where we always kind of say in kind of a pithy way that he's done well out of this. He's her trophy husband. She's the beautiful one, the intelligent one, the go-getting one. What's he bringing to the party? Everyone's just going, I'm not entirely sure. What he seems to bring to the party was this stability. And that we all know relationships where you have the one person who's very outgoing and doing things, and the partner is the lot more stable, solid type. That seems to be the dynamic going on there. Anyway, perhaps they met earlier. This is where Tolkien changed his mind a few times, but definitely that's when they fell in love and eventually married. And they headed over into, at the end of the First Age, into the Second Age. It ended up in Lindon, and around the year 300 of the Second Age, that's when they had a child, Celebrian. So from there, it gets a little bit murky. They seem to have gone to a few other places. Howland's mentioned, and a couple of other places. Ended up in Eregion. They certainly seem to have been there when Sauron appears. They kind of seem to go their different ways, as we mentioned, in as much as Galadriel heads over the Misty Mountains, goes to what will become Lothlorien later. Celeborn seems to stay in Eregion. They meet up again. He doesn't want to go through the Misty Mountains, so she heads back through there. Eventually, presumably, he goes the long way around to end up in Lothlorien. But yeah, that's basically their story. And they spend a long time apart, as far as we can tell. But that doesn't bring with it any implication that they weren't absolutely devoted to each other. Elves, within Tolkien's world, elves, they marry, they mate with one person, they love one person, and that is it. There's a, and this is at least part of the nature of who they are, that elves are eternal. So they just carry on. They're always going to be there in some way, shape, or form. You could die in Middle Earth and then go to the halls of Mandos and then come back, because they are tied to Arda. So this is for life. There's no Galadriel wasn't tempted by anyone else. Celeborn wasn't tempted by anyone else. They're a couple. Martin S. Hi there, Martin. Great to see you. Saying, sometimes when you write fiction, certain characters grow in importance. Happens when I write. Nothing odd. It happened to Tolkien. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. So this is a thing with Tolkien. With Galadriel, she grew in importance as he was writing. Quite a few characters kind of grew in importance. In fact, there's this fantastic little quote from him, which I don't have in front of me, when he talks about when he started writing all of the things that he didn't know were going to happen. He didn't know Lothlorien existed when he started writing the Lord of the Rings. Just as we're using this as an example, Lothlorien did not exist in his mind before he was writing the Lord of the Rings. Yes, he created this magnificent world. Yes, there probably was a forest there called Lothlorien, but what it was, he didn't know. It was only as the Fellowship approached it that he started to flesh that out. And as he was writing the Lord of the Rings, and even after he was writing the Lord of the Rings, he added to this character of Galadriel, and she became more and more important. Samantha Drake saying, a queen needs a general for her troops, not a king to compete with her. That's how I see Galadriel and Celeborn. Yep, that makes absolute sense. Let's go to a question from Jones Norrie saying, I'll ask the usual question about the economic system. Did they import food and supplies, and what did they trade? Well, it's a good question. We're not told exactly, but it certainly appears that for the most part, they were self-sufficient. They certainly could grow their own things. They could forage. There wasn't a huge population of elves, it has to be said. And they don't seem to be, compared to, say, Mirkwood, where Tolkien, people often sort of say he doesn't think through these kind of things to do economics. I think he did a lot more than people think. What is it? What if you had to kind of name a couple of foodstuffs that they seem to have? Wine was a thing, as was butter. Now, wine obviously needs vineyards. Butter comes from cows. Both of those things don't grow naturally within forests. So that's why they had to be doing all of that trading. But we don't get that much of that kind of feel when we're here with the elves of Lothlorien. They seem to be a lot more self-sufficient. Now, were they completely self-sufficient? Probably not. As we've noted, there was that positive relationship with the elves of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, I think the implication there is that there probably was some trading, not huge amounts of trading, but the dwarves definitely did a lot of trading. They had to because they lived underground, and so if they wanted foodstuffs, then they had to be trading for it. There is I would call it a chapter. It's not really a chapter. It's a couple of pages in The Nature of Middle Earth, which are about the Elvish economy. Tolkien specifically talked about the economy of Doriath, which, as we've noted, has got some kind of echoes across to not just Mirkwood, but also Lothlorien. And they did trade. They had some fields just outside the forests, and they would trade with the dwarves nearby. So we're told specifically that's what happened there. I think the implication has to be that's something like what must have happened here. Pardon me. We're not told about it, and it appears to have happened a lot less recently. Certainly, there doesn't seem to have been much trade with the elves of Mirkwood. The Rohirrim seem not to have a particularly positive view of them, which leads you to wonder who they might have traded with. The dwarves in time, yes. Others, it's not so clear. So I think the answer is they're mostly self-sufficient, but that doesn't mean that they don't trade. They also very simple life, if you remember, and a lot of what they need is done by what we might call magic, but Galadriel would probably object and say it's not actually magic. So the lights, things like that, they didn't need to craft anything there. They could do that themselves. Roman Lakovets or Romania Lakovets. Why does Gimli respond so deeply to Galadriel and Lothlorien compared to the other members of the Fellowship? I could do a video on Gimli and Galadriel's gift. And I did focus, it has to be said, a lot more on Galadriel's side here. But one thing which you probably don't notice until you're doing a reread of that chapter is how she treats him. So Gimli has, I think, out of all the members of the Fellowship, probably the biggest character journey. It often goes unremarked, but if you think about what he goes through, first of all, he goes to see what happened to his family, discovers they all got wiped out in Moria. He gets to see what's a great holy site for him just outside the east gate of Moria. Then he goes to Lothlorien. He's been told this is an absolutely terrible place and they hate dwarves there. And lo and behold, he is treated horribly by the elves there. They're calling him names. They're treating him differently to absolutely everybody else, not because of anything he's done, but simply because he's a dwarf. Similarly, he faces up to Fangorn that he's heard terrible things about. He sees the glittering caves. He meets a friend in Legolas, strikes a friendship, which ends symbolically ends all of this bad blood. So he goes through this huge personal journey, does Gimli. Galadriel plays an important part in this. So he arrives in Lothlorien, and they're there sort of basically the elves are saying we should probably kill you. Stop calling him names, blaming him for stuff, and they say he has to be blindfolded because he can't be trusted. Everyone else is okay. He's treated really poorly. He gets there presented to the Lord and Lady, and Celeborn immediately comes in and basically starts blaming him and the dwarves for Gandalf's death. just like harking back hundreds of years. Doesn't seem like it to elves, obviously, but saying, look, if the dwarves hadn't been digging too deeply, they wouldn't have got that Balrog. The Balrog would not have come to the surface, and then the Balrog wouldn't have been there to be able to kill Gandalf. So basically, this is all your fault. Gimli's getting it from every angle there in Lothlorien. And it's Galadriel who basically says, just hold on there, Celeborn. That's not fair. I think you should repent of that. Basically, she says to him, I think you need to just take a deep breath and apologize. And to be fair to him, he kind of does. And then she starts talking directly to Gimli and talks about, it's only like a paragraph or so, but she talks to him about Khazad-dûm. And she uses the dwarven names for places. Remember, she had been friends with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. She'd travelled through there 2 or 3 times. And she clearly saw the beauty in it and loved it. And so for Gimli, he'd been faced with all of this abuse. And then suddenly we get someone who he's expecting to be just giving him more of this, who not only just tells everybody to calm down, but speaks to him in his own language, which must have had an impact on him, and added to which she is this amazing, wonderful, and powerful and beautiful woman. So that's why he responded so well to it. So yeah, it's a good question, but it's like Tolkien just gives us. Let me see if I can. If it takes me not long, then I will see whether I can actually find the actual quote. Let's go to. Here we go. Just talk amongst yourselves for a moment. I'll see whether I can get this quote. It may take a bit longer than I thought. Okay, so while I'm just trying to scroll through this, Matthew Ryan has got a question. Who says, and this is a question from a member on here on YouTube. You can be, I said the best way to be supporting this channel is via Patreon, but if you, for whatever reason, do not wish to go onto Patreon, then you can also support this channel by becoming a member here on YouTube. And that kind of highlights things you say, make it easier for me to spot them. And Matthew says, as a completely Tolkien illiterate viewer, are there any bad elves that acted uncharacteristically immoral or chauvinistic? Any bad apples or groups? Yes. To the extent of if you read the Silmarillion, you will be completely disabused of this notion that I think it's Peter Jackson's fault. I don't mean this in a bad way. I love the films, but he presented elves as being this wonderful, beautiful, ethereal, almost perfect set of people. They were not. If you read the Silmarillion, you will find that there are some horrendous elves out there. Fëanor, who we talked about a bit earlier, he led the Noldor elves, of which Galadriel is one of the Noldor elves. He was the mightiest of all of them, but at the same time, he performed some horrendous acts, and he made his sons swear to recover the Silmarils and not let anybody ever have them apart from them, which led them to be doing some even more horrendous acts. The first age of Middle Earth is littered with elves. There are more horrendous elf um, actions than there are good and perfect and upright actions. The elves that we have, who we see most within the Lord of the Rings, are some of the best ones. Yes, there are plenty who don't do good, but what we see in the Third Age are some of the cream of the crop that's left. I have, while I've been doing that, I've been scrolling through. I have found this that I was talking. This is where Gimli sees Galadriel and where he sort of his mind shifts. Um, so we get Galadriel saying this. She kind of chides Celeborn, and then she says, "Dark is the water of Khaled-Zaram, and cold are the springs of Kibil-Nala, and fair were the many-pillared halls of Khazad-dûm in elder days before the fall of mighty kings beneath the stone." She looked upon Gimli, who sat glowering and sad, and she smiled. And the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw there love and understanding. Wonder came into his face, and then he smiled in answer. So that is what Tolkien tells us, is that she was kind to him. He was expecting enemies everywhere. He'd seen people, elves everywhere, who were horrendous to him. He grew up. Don't forget, this is Gimli, son of Glúin, who had been there part of the quest of Erebor. They'd been happily heading to try and reclaim their homeland of the Lonely Mountain, and they'd been hungry and lost in Mirkwood, stumbling around looking for any way out of this. And they'd been put in prison basically forever by Thranduil. And then Bilbo let them out. And then Thranduil turns up and tries to take the treasure that was theirs. So he doesn't have a good impression of elves. And then he looked into Galadriel's eyes, expecting to see an enemy, and instead saw a friend. So that's what we've got going on now. Okay, let's go to a question from Matthew Martell. What about Lorien interested Galadriel? Was she already eyeing it up before relinquishing her rule over Eregion? So she didn't rule over Eregion. But was she eyeing it up? We're not told, but I think the clear implication is yes. We are told that the whole reason that she went to Middle-earth was because she wanted to rule some lands of her own. And if she was going to look around, where is she going to go? Because she couldn't just, rule a bit of land and say, "This is my land, I'm in charge of all of this land." She needed a people. And so she needed a people who were willingly looking for somebody to lead them. So within that, Lothlorien is probably the only real option she had. So yes, she was looking for it. There were a people, even at that time when she first really came across them, there in the Second Age. Even then, they were an elvish people who had welcomed someone who was not of their own to come in and rule over them. So that will immediately be got to go, so this can work. So yes, she was almost certainly sort of eyeing it up and weighing up the possibility. At NOS saying, is there an explanation for the inherent conflict between elves' need for permanence and their association with nature, the ever-changing cycle of life and death? I mean, I think so. I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that. So the elves' relationship with nature is there because their fates are tied to Arda. And this is quite an important point for Tolkien. He gets quite theological quite quickly when you start going down this route, but he basically said there's actually an inherent difference between elves and humans. He said, you've got the physical and the spiritual, the Hora and the fair, and these are kind of tied together. But for the elves, this is all tied in with Arda, so they're always going to be tied to the land. When they die, the body dies, the spirit goes to the halls of Mandos, which is still tied in with this plane, and they can be sort of rebodied, as it were. This is what happened to Glorfindel, for example. Humans, if they die, then their spirit goes, we don't know. And so this was, incidentally, this is part of the what happened with Numenor when humans were jealous of the long lives of elves, which you can understand from a human perspective. The elves are here, they live forever. Why can't we live forever? Oh, there's a place called the Undying Lands. Perhaps if we go there, we won't die either. So you can understand that from a human perspective where that comes from. The elves were bemused by this because they thought to themselves, it's almost like they're chained to this land. I mean, they would enjoy it and they like it, but at the same time, they can't leave. As long as Arda's there, they are there. Spirit, they can't even that even if their body dies, spiritually they're bound there. Humans, they saw this as their blessing for humans. Their spirit, once their body goes, their spirit can head off somewhere. So this was a huge disconnect in worldviews between the elves and the humans. But that kind of goes to explain why we have this connection between elves and nature, because they are a part of it. They are bound to this world. And so that's why when Galadriel is talking about, Sam talks about elf magic and she just doesn't quite understand it. What she's trying to say is that what you might call magic is us doing these things here, but this is basically, she doesn't say it in these exact words, but this is a kind of working with nature and making things happen. It might look magical to you, but that's not what we think. So that's why we get that. The ever-changing nature of Middle-earth is a slightly different point, which is, you're right, there is an inherent tension there, which is why when the Valar first came across the first children of Iluvatar, the elves, they said, come with us over to the Undying Lands, because this is what is right for you. This is what works for you. The peace is right, because here you're living forever, and here you'll find birth, death, rebirth, renewal, things shifting and changing all the time, and it's going to tire you because you're going to be there and you're going to become friends with this person, and then they're going to grow old and die, and then somebody else is going to grow old and die, and then somebody else is going to grow old and die. You're going to be exactly the same. And these trees, even these trees, they're going to start as saplings and grow up and then die, and then there'll be another one here, and then you'll get this changing of the seasons again and again and again. That's not the pace that your body is naturally tuned to. So you should come over to the Undying Lands. So that's that idea. And the Valar were right. That was the right place for them. And Middle-earth is not, which is why eventually, if the elves stayed in Middle-earth, then they would fade. Basically, it's that it's like it would tire them over time. So yeah, there's an inbuilt tension going on there, and what the elves, particularly of the Second Age, we're trying to do. Tolkien does write about this in one of his letters. And he says, particularly the elves of Eregion, they were trying to find a way because they wanted to stay in Middle Earth. They liked being in Middle Earth. They were big and impressive people in Middle Earth. They wouldn't have been if they'd gone over to Valinor. So they wanted to stay in Middle Earth. But they knew that the ravages of time were not good for them here. So they were trying to find ways to protect themselves against that, which is where the Rings of Power comes in. Sauron understood this, and he kind of played with this. He played into what they were wanting to do, and that's how he got Celebrimbor to be working with him on this, because it is about preservation. And when Sauron had gone, and then Celebrimbor on his own made those 3 Rings of Power, they were about preservation, because he knew that what the elves needed in order to be staying in Middle-earth was this kind of magic, holding time at bay. And sure enough, that's what happens. In Rivendell and Lothlorien, the ring's power was being used to allow the elves to carry on living them there without being wearied by it. And when the power of the rings had gone, that's when those elves headed off. I hope that explains it too. As I said, Tolkien gets quite deep quite quickly when he's talking about this kind of stuff. But I think at a high level, if you just think about it, those elves are tied to this world. Therefore, naturally, they work with this with nature. However, their natural home is not with the cycle of birth, death, rebirth. Samantha Drake, do we know anything about what Lothlorien was doing during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs? I know it was mostly underground, but Lothlorien is so close to Moria. Did they help at all? I don't think we're told that they did. I would have to have a look. I can't remember that we're told that, they did. The fact of the matter is that we're not told huge amounts about the war. But yeah, it was it was a big war for the dwarves. The histories. The reason I'm pausing was I was trying to work out if there was anything that's there. I don't think there is. The histories that we have are written. We always have to remember this. That it's written mostly by the elves. Obviously, we get the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit written by hobbits, but the Silmarillion and all of the other histories and things are written in world by elves. So they are telling the story from the elves' perspective. And that is why we know so much more about what the elves were up to in the First Age and Second Age, for example, than we do about the dwarves. In fact, there's only one. There are 7 dwarven tribes, and there's only one of them that we know any significant thing about Durin's folks, the Longbeards, in Khazad-dûm. There were 2 more tribes in the Blue Mountains, who we know a little bit about what happened with them, but then we've got 4 other tribes who we know almost nothing about at all, because this is not the stories, the histories we've been told are not the histories of the dwarves, they're the histories of the elves. So I think the short answer is probably not. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if Galadriel helped out. She was a friend of them, but I don't think we've got a record of it. We were just doing a link there in the chat to who wrote the Legendarium in world. So that's one of those ones. Every now and then when I do that, I do videos. I think this is a really important point to be making in order to understand Tolkien's world. But I'm not sure that this is going to be one of the videos that gets a huge amount of views. I think that's one of those ones. Who wrote the Legendarium in world is a really important thing, because Tolkien, in terms of understanding this world we have, because Tolkien had his entire writing conceit was that he was just this bumbling old professor who'd stumbled across these ancient tomes, and now he was translating them for us. And so those ancient tomes were written by certain people, and he tells us who these were written by. And what that means is that whereas we sometimes think, and I have to admit, I once thought of this as just being this kind of like everything's written from this third person omnipotent perspective, it's not. This is in world written by certain groups of people. And so the classic example I will always give on this one is the petty dwarves. Now, who are the petty dwarves? You will read in the Silmarillion about the petty dwarves, and they don't come across all that well. But then when you just pause for one moment and go, so who are this? Is another tribe of dwarves. And they were hunted down to extinction by the elves. It's never written as a bad thing. It's just a thing they did before the elves realized that, yeah, maybe maybe they are intelligent beings after all. And then we don't even know what that race was called. That race of dwarves was called. We just know them as the petty dwarves because that's what the elves called them. Incredibly derogatory name. Um, Tolkien writes at a level beyond what we often think. The petty dwarves probably called themselves, I think it's something like the moon dwarves or something like that. But we don't remember them that way because the story is presented by the elves. Mad Dog. Don't get mad, but I hated The Punisher and I hate George R. R. Martin. He hasn't done anything in 15 years. It's been a bad investment. I feel like my namesake mad. I don't get mad. The Punisher, if that's the TV show, I don't think I watched it. George R. R. Martin hasn't done anything in 15 years. He has done things in the last 15 years. Um, he's not written The Winds of Winter. If you wish to be annoyed with him over that, I entirely understand it. That's not a problem. But we've got a stage play to look forward to, which I am very much looking forward to. Let's go to James Perkins saying, we see elven civilization take a number of different forms over the years in Arda, from the subterranean the Thousand Halls of Menegroth to the much more traditionally styled secret-walled city of Gondolin. While there can be no doubt that the Third Age elven cities pale in comparison to their First Age counterparts, it would seem that most of them reflected some form of elven civilization from the past. Thranduil's woodland realm, very similar to Thingol's aforementioned Menegroth. We were talking about this a moment ago. Círdan has been fairly consistent with his various havens over the millennia, and even Elrond and the Last Homely House are reminiscent of some of the standalone elven holdouts like Minas Tirith, the first Minas Tirith. Lorien stands apart, however, as a completely different kind of elven settlement. The forest seems not just inseparable from the city, but completely dominant over it, with very few of the standard hallmarks of other civilizations the elves construct at any other point in their history. Why do you think the land of Lorien is so different? Who built it the way it is now? Was this Galadriel's vision, Celeborn's? It is certainly the most unique civilization we encounter throughout the entire saga, and it has an undeniable sense of separation from all the other elven lands. So I've read that one out in full, partly because I thought it was well written, but also um, because I think a lot of this we picked up in what we've been talking about before. What I will say, though, is it is different when we're talking about a civilization that is reminiscent of earlier. This was one of the first elven civilizations, and it has not changed significantly in a very long period of time. So what Galadriel did was she kind of shifted the home base and she created the kind of the central hub. It's not, city's the wrong way of saying this because it's not, and it's never really described as being like a town or anything. It's just like, where is the heart of the forest? And they sleep on flets, like wooden platforms. It's pretty much as you can imagine it from the films. It's not. It is a unique vision but at the same time, it is built on what was already there. This would not have been a completely new and crazy thing for these elves. This is just an expansion of what they already knew about. Renebe Mitra saying, "Salutations, Robert and Dan the dog. In Unfinished Tales, it is said that when Steward Kirion of Gondor first requested aid from the Aotheod up north, King Eol's journey was aided by Galadriel, with her using Nenya to send a white mist that kept the forces of Dol Guldur at bay as the Aotheod crossed the Vales of the Anduin. This aid helped the Rohirrim eventually help Gondor and be gifted the lands of Rohan. Why did she decide to aid them? Can it be down to her foresight? Or do you speculate something greater at play during this specific period of the Third Age, such that Galadriel explicitly decided to intervene?" So, foresight, I think, is the most straightforward answer to this. Yes, you picked up on a thing that happened that, yeah, I think it was in Unfinished Tales. It's a sort of a casual mention. Tolkien kind of drops in there. Galadriel's foresight is quite common to a lot of the elves. So I don't think a lot of the wise, as we said. You can see people like Glorfindel, Círdan, Elrond. They all have some kind of foresight to them. So it's not that Galadriel is unique in this. However, she is the most powerful elf left. This is something Tolkien says, the most powerful elf left in the Third Age. So her powers of foresight are bigger and better than those of others. And yes, so helping the establishment of Rohan is not just important for the story that we know about, but Rohan was there as this kind of bulwark against forces from the west, from the Dunlendings. Now, the Dunlendings several times attacked in from the west. If the Rohirrim hadn't been there, that whole area used to be a part of wider Gondor. If they hadn't come in, then the Dunlendings would have pushed into what we now know as Rohan and been an enemy on the western border of Gondor. That almost certainly will have had to distract some of Gondor's attention away from the job that they were supposed to be doing. Weren't always doing it particularly well, but they were supposed to be keeping an eye on Mordor. And that will have had a number of negative impacts through the years. Maybe Sauron could have grown even stronger quicker. Maybe the Witch King could have pushed in and done more bad stuff sooner as well. It's hard to say. All of these kind of like what ifs. It's hard to say exactly what, but it's very clear that in any foreseeable future, having Rohan existing was good, not just for that part of the world, but also for protecting Gondor. And Gondor, for all of the slightly snarky comments we have, it did do the job of holding back the forces of evil from coming through. The geography of Middle-earth is such that if the forces of evil wanted to come from Mordor and attack the rest of Middle-earth, they pretty much had to either find a way across an incredibly wide and fast-moving river, or they had to go through Gondor. So that was absolutely essential. Foresight, yes. General geostrategic understanding of the world is also the case, I think. Martin S., you mentioned Feanor among horrible elves, and I agree. I would strike a blow for Eol and his son Maeglin being awful too, and more contemptible. Yeah. So, I mean, Feanor is not an elf who's easy to like, let's put it that way. And Tolkien very much makes it clear that the oath that he makes his sons swear to leads to, I probably said horrible things. It leads to kinslaying, it leads to betrayal, it leads to abductions, it leads to stealing things, it leads to the destruction of entire cities, it leads to horrors all through the First Age. And these are perpetrated by elves, often against other elves. So there's a lot of pretty horrible ones. Ale and Maeglin, I would agree. Yeah, not good. Mike Marco over on Facebook. Great to see you saying, speaking of foresight, do you think Vilya aided Elrond's foresight? Tolkien says that Vilya was the chief of the Elven Rings, but we never see it opposed to Narya with Gandalf using it on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and Nenya obviously helps Galadriel preserve Lorien. Yeah, he does say it's the most powerful, it's the chief of the three. Would it help with foresight? Almost certainly. I think the rings, when we're not told their exact powers, and this is a, a, a thing which is common to Tolkien. He doesn't like to get down into. He's not Brandon Sanderson. He doesn't tell you exactly how his magic system works. He shows us, so we can see Gandalf's ring. Certainly seems to allow him to do a lot more fire magic. It's as the ring of fire. That's his favorite kind of magic, it would appear. He's always there, yeah, lighting fires, throwing fiery pine cones, doing fireworks, like low-level fire magic, but fire magic is his go-to. And also, it keeps him, when Círdan gives it to him, he basically says, this is to keep you going. This is to give you strength and encouragement, because of the preserving effect of it. So there was definitely a preserving effect going on there. I think probably this helped. The Rings of Power seem to, just as a general thing, it sort of exacerbate, improve, multiply the powers that you already have. It's not about giving you new powers. So this is why hobbits can more easily sort of resist the temptations of the One Ring, because they are low power individuals. When you're a high power individual like Elrond, then it adds to what you've already got. So I think it certainly helped him with healing, for example. But yes, very much with foresight, and he does come out with a lot. His when he's putting together the fellowship, and he does sort of come up with these, like, I see this is the time when, and he is a lot more eloquent than me, but he sort of says, this is the time for the halflings to shine, and that's a real bit of foresight. Most people would not have thought, yeah, we should give it to the hobbits. Question from Cars Ballerina. Is Galadriel the only known female primary ruling elf? What happens to the elves of Lothlorien after they go to Aman? Are they given their own land? Can Galadriel still rule over them, or do they get subsumed into an existing kingdom? So in terms of female primary ruling elf, I mean, I think the answer is yes. We certainly get some pretty powerful female elves, but certainly in terms of primary ruling, then the ruling, the king, basically, in of the elves of the West, the line of Gil-galad backwards, that was all men. Then you get Elrond, who probably, if he'd wanted to, he could probably have claimed that title, being the king, but didn't. Obviously, we get Thranduil and his antecedents there in Mirkwood. Círdan's ruling his own little area. So the answer to the first question is yes, she is the only known female primary ruling elf. What happens to them after they get to Aman? Well, we don't know in as much as Tolkien doesn't give us an exact set of instructions about what happens, but all the implications are that the elves who were in Middle Earth and then go to the Undying Lands, they slot into the structures of the elves who are already there. By which we mean that there are high kings of the different the main three elven tribes there. Galadriel was ruling lands. This is one of the main reasons why she wanted to stay in Middle Earth, to be ruling lands in Middle Earth. And she must, when she passes the test, she must diminish and head west and remain Galadriel. So she's not going to become a queen or anything like that. She will head back and regain her former position back there. Now, we're not told the details, typical for Tolkien of this kind of thing, but yeah, they would go back and just sort of slot back in, because there's already ruling Noldor, and there's also a ruling High King of the Elves as well. Then it's not that she's going to turn up and then everyone will go, oh, let's carve out a little bit of extra land for Galadriel to be in charge of. She can rule us over here. No, she will just go back to the role that she had before. Right, let's go to Demetrius. I didn't know today was a proper live stream instead of a pre-record. Hope everyone is doing well. Yeah, thank you. This is kind of trying to make up for last week where I tried to do a pre-record and it didn't quite work. Okay, I think those are the last question from my patrons about Lothlorien. Now is a good time to drop any more questions into the chat. I'm very happy to pick up on them as we go through. I have a question. Oh, Mike Marco, thank you very much. The hour of the Shire to shake the towers of the wise. That's, I told you Tolkien could say it much more eloquently than me, obviously. So we've got 2 questions from Adam Geetz over on Patreon, which are a Song of Ice and Fire questions. So I shall quickly answer them, but happy to answer any more questions about Lothlorien. Adam Geetz saying, how do you envision the sword Dawn getting all the way up to the north? I would think Darkstar will have it and will lose it to Dany when her group defeats Fagon. From there, I would think someone in her inner circle would bring it to the north to fight the others. Maybe she gives it to Jon when she takes Longclaw from him to give to Jorah. So yeah, that's so Dawn is the ancestral sword of House Dane. Many of us think that it's got some big role to play. Maybe it even is Lightbringer or something along those lines. It is not a normal Valyrian steel sword. It is probably millennia old and it is forged from a fallen star. So how's it going to get to the north? I think you're probably what you said is probably the majority position amongst people who've theorized this. I have to say it is probably going to come into the ownership of Darkstar, who is from a cadet branch of House Dane, and he seems very jealous of he's Sir Gerald Dane. He seems very jealous of Arthur Dane, who was the last sword of the morning. And he basically says he's the sword of the evening, but probably as he's now on the run, we're expecting him to get hold of this sword to take it. He shouldn't take it. It should only be given to those who are worthy. But then probably where is he going to go with this? He's on the run from basically all of Dawn at this point. He has to go to the only place, I think, where he might find himself safe from House Martell, which would be with that of a king. I've heard some suggest maybe he might go to Cersei. It's possible. But if he finds out about Fagon arriving, this person saying that they are Aegon the Sixth, if he could go there and try and put himself forward as part of the Kingsguard. Fagon will want this because he clearly is impressive, and also this harkens back to that last legendary Kingsguard under Eris the Second, the Mad King, which Arthur Dane was a part of. After that, yeah, I think we get the foreshadowing from Dany way back in book 1 saying that she's going to give Ser Jorah a sword worthy of him. If Jon appears with Ser Jorah's family sword, then yeah, she may well give that to him. Possible, I don't know, speculating, it's possible that she might say, yeah, you can have access to the Dragonglass mines as long as you give me that sword, because there would have to be a reason for Jon to be giving up that sword. Maybe he gets Dawn from there, and maybe it goes up from there. That's the majority position. I've got a video coming out at some point soon on Dark Star, so we'll sort of tease some of that out. Do you think there will be any problems with Jon using the Sword of Dawn? We know the mantle of Sword of the Morning is passed down to only worthy Dane members. Could the sword initially reject Jon? Maybe the sword has some sentience, and when Jon is holding it, it will heat up as it's supposed to. It's possible. We don't know. We've not seen. First of all, we have to say we've not seen the Sword of Dawn in the story. The closest we've got is Ned's fever dream. And the couple of characters like Jaime have got this vague memory of Arthur Dane. So we don't know exactly what it's like. We don't know how it operates. We've not been told that it chooses the bearer or anything along those lines. Could this be why it goes on fire? Who knows? Jon having it would certainly go against the traditions of House Dane. I do wonder if we go with my working theory that Ashara Dane is married to Howland Reed in the Neck, then Howland Reed, when he emerges from the Neck, and he will at some point, to info dump lots of information to us, which he will, because George R. Martin has told us that he will. Perhaps part of that could be Howland Reed saying, "Oh yeah, and that sword, House Dane were just holding on to it. We've got clearance now to use it for whoever we think is the real leader of this. Prince was promised. Maybe that's how it's going to work out. I don't know." Okay, let's go to questions in the chat. Carlos Ballerina, how did Lothlorien elves deal with worldly decay before Nenya? Why don't the Mirkwood elves seem to suffer from living there without preserving magic? I mean, it's a good question. So, in the same way that the elves survived in Mirkwood, would probably be my answer. They lived a life which kept the outside world shut off. They obviously will have been wearied by the world and the constant death, growth, rebirth, whatever. All of that will have been having its toll, and one suspects that what will have happened is that, as with the other elves, drip, 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 over time, more and more of them will have headed off west. It's only when Galadriel came in and actually kind of like stopped it that they probably would have not been heading that way. Why don't the Mirkwood elves seem to suffer from living there without preserving magic? Well, they do certainly seem to be suffering, in as much as if you had to pick an elvish community that is struggling, it would be the Northern Mirkwood elves. Their homeland was all of Greenwood the Great, and they've got pushed back and pushed back and pushed back into this one tiny corner of Mirkwood, and they seem to be the least powerful of the elves that are there. They certainly the least. I mean, in the Hobbit films, they were made to look pretty impressive as an army, but they're not. They're living the simple life there in those woods. So part of it is the living close to nature, that kind of stuff. Part of it, I think, Tolkien would say, is they're just getting on and enjoying life. They're having feasts. They're drinking wine. They're having a good time. It's the opposite of what's happening in Lothlorien. Lothlorians see what's in the outside world and are trying to keep it out. In Mirkwood, it's la 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 la. Don't want to know what's going on. Let's have a quick look. What other things are there? And Demetrius saying, yeah, the king is suffering from PTSD and leading a lavish lifestyle to make up for. Yes, absolutely. So exactly what I was saying. Last Red Star, is Galadriel related to the first king of the Noldor? Yes, she's basically part of the wider Noldorin royal family. So she's right up there. She was cousin to Fëanor. So yeah, those, and Fëanor was king of the Noldor, inherited from his father, who was the first of the kings of the Noldor. So yeah, she's part of the wider royal family. Right, let's last quick flick through. Finway's Rabbi Mitra saying Finway's granddaughter via Finarfin. Yeah, something along those lines. The elven family tree. If you ever think that the Targaryen family trees get a little bit complicated with names that sound quite similar, Tolkien doesn't often resort to characters having the same name. He does sometimes, but most of the time he doesn't. But a lot of people in the same family have very similar sounding names, and they also often have more than one name each. Okay, so I think with that, probably we will. I think that's all my questions I've had from Patreon. So next week we'll be back with and A Song of Ice and Fire one. I don't know where we're at. I think we finished all the Stark Children. Correct me if I'm wrong. But we will perhaps dive back into what I was going with, which was characters that have an outsized impact on the story given the amount of screen time or page time they have. I will come up with a better or pithier title for that kind of series of videos, but we were kind of working our way through that, and so we'll come back onto that one. But that's what's happening next week. Over on the main channel, there will be the normal set of videos, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and yeah, keep an eye out for a few more compilations coming along. People seem to be liking them. But that, I think, is a cue for me to say, moderators, thank you. You're amazing. If you are watching this live on YouTube, please do show a little bit of love to the moderators. If you're a patron, thank you. I hugely appreciate it. If you would like to support this channel, the best way to do that is through Patreon, and there's a link appearing somewhere around here. If you want to watch a few more of these videos, there's a link to some other live stream somewhere around here. That is all for this time. Take care, everyone, and I shall see you again soon.